Terracon stretched a singed hand, hurt more by her surrender than by any of Marco's blasts. "No," he attempted. "No," he moaned defiantly, and tried to pry himself from the wagon's bed. "Ah!" A bolt of blistering light lashed from Marco's gem, teased Terracon down again. "Take it," Cassandra offered in an effort to deter prolonging the torture. She pulled open the black robe to reveal her golden belts and bare belly. "I was trusted with the power to change, graced with the right to defy. You do not approve? Es esimne purush? The witches will learn, you say? Then teach me." Sedwa's desire was at last at hand. Her threat was invoked, her dare engaged. Her long fingers seized and cramped and crawled to grasp the elusive divine right. Cassandra knew that feeling well. She had clawed and scratched for salvation from her consuming thoughts, that ravenous depth, that chasm between her thoughts and dreams. The black nails of the pixie could never rake out a well deeper than the pit of despair which already haunted every daughter of Hexen. "Take it!" Cassandra hoped out loud. The pixie lunged, burying both hands shoulder deep in the shapeless plain of the Hexen princess's stomach. Cassandra gasped against the thrust, stealing one last breath before the pixie's paralysis suffocated her. Every muscle clenched rigid. Her whole body seized out of her control. The distance between her intentions and her effects grew wide. She was flailing, swimming, lashing out. Only the knots in her muscles would not be undone. The whole of her body seemed too heavy to move. With each attempt, however, she found herself slipping from the shell of her body. There was an effervescence in the pixie's intoxicating molestation, frothing and washing her out of herself. She swam against the currents, spilling, pouring up her limbs. The gravity that anchored her weight slithered off in ribbons that tickled like silk unfurling around her ribs. She was heaved up, detached, uninvolved, absent. Taoesh black magic. Words were still defined, though she had no lips with which to articulate them. "I am escaping." The cold horror of need laced itself around her, and she delighted in its tracing, trailing, its wanton fondling for her. The grasping, needing, wanting, pecking, pinching that had tormented every lonesome moment, had haunted every forgotten duty and neglected task, was at last something for which she could want to reach. She stretched for it. She could feel it, how it sought her, the flickering of its fingers just beyond her own. It locked onto her limbs before the follies of the world evaporated, and the drag of their falling away only served to cinch her secure. As constant as a shadow, so constant is the presence of the divine, the presence of black magic. Black magic. These were the hands of black magic, seeking and sorting, drawing her out of the milieu. She was the stillness, and everything that drifted past was not of her. Every sense was teased and taunted belligerently, incessantly. Moods erupted. Titillations traced, trailed. Pops of color, flushing in the current, blasted her numb and blinded her blank. She tried to shield her sight, but her curiosity was steadfast, almost her only aspect which was, and she strained to see. The only relief dimly discernible was her distant shadow, whipping violently, bullied by the lights, a droplet of spilled darkness, lapping and thrashing, and only a moment from splashing and splattering apart. Cassandra was not herself, so what could it resemble? She was without definition, so it was without definition. Her own darkness had no form. Only in that she quieted herself did it grow, leaking long as it streamed from her feet across the light and into the distance. Limbs leaked from the tongues of the splatter, coalescing in the definition of sinews and joints. The silhouette strapped muscles with more strength than had ever roped her frame, and stretched far taller than her vantage had ever granted. Despite the build and bulk of the shade, its pantomime was perfect, kneeling as she did to press palm against palm. The darkness continued to spill. The slathering shadows swallowed the light, soaking it deep in pitch until there was only one flickering star fending off the encroaching darkness. What once were the limbs of the behemoth silhouette were now her fingers closing in on the star. She held it in her hand, brought it closer to examine it. Colors splashed, braiding and trading places, washing her features over in chiaroscuro. The vibrance of each tint was matched by the vibration of each pitch. It was busy, but discernible by its contrast to the silence, the stillness of the now omnipresent shadow. You admire your art until it casts the shadow of truth. We are all just tints in the spectrum. She was a tint in the spectrum, glowing against the darkness and shone on by other tints. She was carved out of the darkness and carved into it. It matched her, shadowed her. Even in sacrifice, her every effort was futile and useless. There was nothing in the darkness, only space to play. You can imagine anything you can perceive. Frequencies descended from a tone, through a buzz, to a trill, to a beat, to something less structured, arrhythmic. There was a crackle, as when bark broke during a burn. It smelled of cinnamon. The hue was the dull orange of the spice. A bouquet wafted past with progressively less heat and ever more verdancy. There came a scent of sage and its dusky green shade. It tinged bluer. The decaying verdigris of patinated bronze screamed at her. Draco screamed at her. Cassandra had always marveled at the match of Draco's teal patinated armor and the auburn in his beard. She missed his teasing and wept at hearing him cry. She felt a hand press on her shoulder, attempting to comfort her. Its touch was cold and waxy, corpse limp, but only because she was not loaning it any warmth. She was allotting the light, administering the sounds, planting the sense. A witch was defined as an agent of change, by her right to defy, yet was it her place to interrupt the dream? She could do anything. In her spoiled upbringing, she had been denied only freedom, and longed for it only to complete her collection. Receiving that wish would bring her aspirations to a standstill. Being still, however, was insufficient. It was not enough to know what one was. Rather, one needed to know where they were headed. Definition came not from being, but from becoming. Create. What though? Capacity with no ambition was a self-imposed stifle. Its horror grew in omnipresent proportions, as overwhelming as the darkness around her. Creation was a burden, a torment. She could meander in 1,000 different possibilities of tints and tones, touch and taste in combinations ceaseless to the point of wasteful. We live in a world of shallow constructs, disparate experiences, each given a chance to do what it does, but which fail every attempt at aspiration or ingenuity. Dream me something else. Black magic had planted inspiration in everything. Orkhan had also said that in the creation there was no room for inspiration. Bound demons, perpetually inspired, meander in the bleak world of their failed creations. Orkhan lives in a world that he can recreate to any extent, but can choose not to. You recreated reality in your own image, and the only thing that changed was your freedom. Their conversation echoed at her, memories resonated in the flickering, a moment held captive in a sequence of the spectrum. She could be petty, need not create a whole world. Where was she? Cassandra knelt before Sedwa. The pixie was buried shoulder-deep in the witch's stomach. Her claws raked the cradle, scratching to tap the branches that would bear the fruit of her womb. Beside Cassandra laid a rust-stained iron sword. Everything the pixie touched corroded. Her attention immediately returned to the flickering. Cassandra scoured for the flash of celadon, the glint of disdain. Her ears peaked at the wail of a baby. The scream tripped through sobbing coughs, finally suffocating in a gasp that readied to scream again. Cassandra could one day bear a child that would wail in such a way, and she could then turn to it, comfort and coo it into silent slumber. Cassandra could corrode that suffering, could decay that pain. Cassandra held the anticipation suspended in the silence which interrupted the cry, and offered it up in sacrifice. It erupted out as the pixie bore in. There was a moment of breaching, and the instant when ambition encountered execution. Cassandra was again deposited in the creation, and all she could do was scream and surrender as her senses were barraged by the follies and filler of the world. Sedwa tore her hands free from the gut. She pressed her clenched, blistered hands against her ears in a pathetic attempt to shield. Cassandra could perceive Sedwa's realization, Sedwa's experience. Blinded by the fury of her pursuit, she corroded the first tint she grasped, her tint in the spectrum. As her tint faded, so grew the darkness. The omnipresent shadow, black magic, mimicked her every move, and as she bored into it, so too did it bore into her. Sedwa tore her ambition. She shred her composition. Rent, all that was left were the scattered scraps of her dreams. The Celadon pixie princess staggered back with each imploded ambition, heaved and seized in revulsion of the consequences of her character. Motivation collapsed on itself, killing off the drive that had instigated this whole sequence of events, without which, Cassandra could perceive, she would never have broken the cuffs of the Orkhon. Sedwa had been just as involved as she was in black magic's design. Content? Cassandra bit back, at last shaking off the inebriation. You thought to bear the hex and curse? Pixie cannot be a witch even when she tries. And all those chances on which you interceded, Cassandra fumed, and in her rage she lunged at the pixie and snatched the leather bands that laced the pacifiers around Sedwa's sinewy, spindle-thin neck. Falling back on her hip, Cassandra thrust the gilded heel of her dancing shoe directly into the pixie's emaciated torso. The lanyard snapped behind Sedwa's neck. Cassandra fell back as the necklaces released. Sedwa flew from the cart. The pixie crashed to the ground, ricocheted off of the gravel-strewn path, and tumbled until the friction burned off her momentum, leaving only a sprawled body to slip into the past. The sympathy with which fairy princesses orchestrated their courts filtered Sedwa's hypocrisy into the pixie rampage crashing down the trail. Fracture splintered the swarm as it collided where Sedwa lay. The fairy bodies pouring in tripped and churned, suddenly nauseous from the swells and dumps of their roaring chase. Pixies and sylphs piled up as they stumbled and trampled one another in a frothing heap. Tormented by their sudden lack of direction, they clamored and riled until they drowned in confusion. The fairies' sympathy to their princess's dementia distracted them from the humble passengers carting away. Tarakon's lips curled into a weak smile as he watched the unseelie court slip away. He nearly giggled her name, having watched her break out from the changeling process. The memory of watching Osmara be brought low before the pixie robbed Tarakon of any endurance to watch Cassandra kneel as she had. He was powerless to save her. Witnessing her submission made him witness his utter futility. Every effort he had made to keep her from danger had been absolutely useless. Every one of his dutiful labors in her life absolutely useless, because she had given up before Sedwa, and absolutely useless because ultimately she did not need him. He had just watched her pry herself from beneath Sedwa's violation. She could have done it whether or not he had been there. Despite recognizing his impotence, however, he was awash in euphoria, for she had endured his weakness, and she had endured when he could not. He mustered a smile, but could have screamed with joy had he had the strength. "No!" Marco whinnied in tantrum, and lunged his clutched ruby into the air to spill electricity over everyone. Cassandra hunched to huddle from the blistering white streaks, but they never struck. She shifted to peek under her arm. Darrell had parried the bolts with a sweep of the rusted sword's blade. The sparks lurched against their fall, magnetically drawn toward the metal sword. Darrell then hacked at the troll's outstretched arm. The edge was too pitted and corroded to cleave off the hand, but the nimble wrists snapped loudly under the crushing blow. Marco bayed, distracted with pain. With a second swing, Darrell batted Marco off of the driver's bench, knocking and throwing him into the trees that filed along the path. The troll's wails could be heard until they grew too distant. No words were exchanged for a long while. The trees whisked past. The cart never slowed. It maintained, instead, the drive of their frenzied escape. Eyes darted around, scoping and soaking in the situation. When a word finally broke from anxious lips, they were stained with the same remnant fear of a child waking from a nightmare, as though it were not yet over. "My hands are burned," Darrell cracked, still holding the iron sword. Cassandra and Rusty, the only other two capable of standing, worked their way to the sergeant. Nikken peeked over his shoulder as they examined. It was not that he held the sword so much as his hands were scalded into fists around the handle, his dominant hand significantly more than the other. The blade was still hot from catching Marco's blast, and Cassandra had to use her cloak as an insulating mitten to help extract the sword. Skin peeled off as the weapon was pried out of Daryl's hands. His already pale palms were blanched and swollen fat. Sympathetic, they cooed and lured him to sit, straining with shaking legs as they propped his muscular bulk in descent. Rusty made Daryl her priority. She massaged his wrists, dampening the heat and wringing out the pain. Her anesthetizing touch also alleviated his panic, and he began to drift into exhaustion as soon as he realized he had survived. Eloise, like Nesu, was breathing, but her body was clenched and cramped. Terracon was also curled up in an attempt to deaden the pain of Marco's blasts. The fork they had passed haunted Nikken. He did not like being unsure where his route would lead, and could not yet answer how they could navigate from their eventual destination back to the closest haven, the Hexen residence at Caldara. Turning around was certainly not an option. When Nikken muttered, "We cannot go back," nobody argued. Nobody could. While their thoughts lingered on the narrow escape, that event had already faded into the past of Cassandra's mind. She was too occupied swimming in the stream of conclusions pouring over her. She sat on her hip in silent meditation, staring blankly over the sideboard while sorting thoughts, assembling them into something discernible, expressible, a statement. The cart strode on. The drumming of galloping hoofs descended to a lullaby patter. The grit of the tree bark grew discernible as the cart slowed, and darker as the evening approached. The tree trunks sprouted less frequently. The branches grew thinner. The canopy strained to seal up the gaps in the leaves, but it had become too sparse to hide the fuchsia stains on the contours of the clouds. The foliage was descending the steps at a sharper incline than the road. Trees were replaced with shrubs, and shrubs replaced with ground cover. It was all wilting. The day, the plants, their path, their progress. The grind of the axle finally grew silent as the wagon stopped amid dead trees. They were safe from the ferry in these barrens. There was no wilderness, no environment to host their nature, only withering and weariness that curled and cowered, only the mourning skeletons of famished, desiccated trees. It was the drought-ravaged wastelands which bordered the Vorsan Desert. Starved and withered vegetation struggled to sip at what remained of the runoff from the distant rains. Damp stains, maybe a trickle of sludge-thick mud. Having at last escaped, they all fell apart, fell asleep. All except Cassandra. She had barely moved for hours and had remained still against the encroaching amethyst night, staring into it with eyes that twinkled like amethyst. The Vorsan Desert granted a keen, patient stargazer the rare dawn and dusk of every star. They were individual, yet innumerable, and they leapt in the slowest of leaps from one horizon to the other. Any single glance would mistake them as stalled in the sky, stuck at that moment. In sequence, however, they twinkled and flickered, tripped and rolled like gems with refracting facets. Cassandra studied these moments in sequence, an oracle and a mystic. Voices heard, spoken, echoed. The dead do not speak. Duties and tasks, tints in the spectrum. The patina green. Draco's patina green. That screaming green. Screaming. Draco is screaming. The dead do not speak, but Draco is screaming. The dead do not speak, and Draco is screaming.